Let's bring in NBC News Chief Capitol Hill correspondent Ryan Nobles and NBC News White House correspondent Vaughn Hilliard, who has been covering the Trump transition. Eugene Robinson is a Washington Post columnist and MSNBC political analyst. Okay, Ryan, have we heard from Speaker Johnson about his decision to replace Mike Turner on Intel?
We have, as a matter of fact, Chris, and he's been very insistent that this was his decision and his decision alone, and that it involved no influence whatsoever from the president-elect or his advisors at Mar-a-Lago. Listen to what Johnson told us earlier today.
It's new Congress. We just need fresh horses in some of these places.
Did Trump have anything to do with this? Trump urged you to not.
This is not a President Trump decision. This is a House decision, and this is no slight whatsoever to our outgoing chairman. He did a great job, but we just the intelligence community and everything related to HPSCI it needs a fresh start, and that's what this is about, nothing else.
We know that Chairman Turner, or former Chairman Turner, has a bit of a different view about it. He seems concerned about the way that this decision process was made. And there is every reason to believe that Donald Trump wouldn't want someone like Mike Turner as the chair of the Intel Committee. He was very pro-funding for Ukraine. He has a different foreign policy worldview than Donald Trump may have. And so that raises some questions as to just how much influence the current or the incoming president may have had in this decision-making process, especially because Mike Johnson remains close to Donald Trump. And there's every reason to believe that Mike Johnson is still the speaker because Donald Trump came in and endorsed him right before the speaker vote when there were several skeptical Republicans wanting to cast a ballot for the speaker. So this is something that we're going to continue to watch. And then the other part of this that we still don't know yet, Chris, is who Johnson will ultimately pick to take Mike Turner's job. Will that be someone who is thought of as a loyalist to Donald Trump, especially in a committee that's as important as the Intel Committee, and also a committee that, despite all of the political polarization over the past 8 years, has had demonstrated a level of bipartisanship at different points. There's been some scuttles here and there, especially throughout the course of the Russia investigation. But, at least during the period of time where Ukraine was involved, demonstrated a great degree of bipartisanship.
So, Vaughn, let's go specifically into some of the details of where Mike Turner and Donald Trump were not on the same page. I mean, Turner did vote to certify Joe Biden's 2020 election victory. He pushed back hard against Trump's claims that Haitian immigrants were eating pets in Springfield, Ohio. Some people may have forgotten that one. Notably, though, he has been a leading proponent for Ukraine funding. So I wonder what you're hearing from Trump world about this.
We're actually hearing very little, Chris, from Trump world and the president-elect himself there. But I think it's important when you're looking at the role that Mike Turner would play as chair of the Intel Committee and understanding that he would work directly with this Trump administration, particularly in the months ahead in which there is a high likelihood that there is going to be potential disagreements over intelligence that is gathered by the United States, particularly when it comes to Russia. It was Mike Turner, let's be very clear, just this last spring, who openly suggested that some members of his own party were uttering Russian propaganda on the House floor, suggesting that the conversation over the justification that Russia has used for its invasion of Ukraine in 2022 was precipitated around this idea that NATO was going to add Ukraine as a member nation, and that justified their attack on Ukraine. Let's be very clear. There were no steps that were being taken in real time at the time of the invasion. And yet it was Donald Trump just 10 days ago at that Mar-a-Lago press conference who suggested that that was, in fact, the case and that he could understand the emotions around Russia and for their decision to invade. And it was Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, just days ago, who publicly lauded Donald Trump, the president-elect, for those statements. It was Mike Turner, again, this last spring, who was very clear when he said that, quote, members of Congress today who still incorrectly say that this conflict between Russia and Ukraine is over NATO, which, of course, it is not. This is an authoritarian versus democracy battle. And it was those statements last spring that undoubtedly have continued to ring down in Mar-a-Lago at this present time.
Eugene, the top Democrat on the Intel Committee, Congressman Jim Himes, put out a statement and said, among other things, The removal of Chairman Turner makes our nation less secure and is a terrible portent for what's to come. The Constitution demands that Congress function as a check and balance to the executive branch, not cater to its demands. And NBC News has reported that lawmakers in both parties were actually stunned at Johnson's decision, given how well-respected Turner is on both sides of the aisle. So what do you think this tells us about the future and about Trump's power just days ahead of his inauguration?
It doesn't tell us anything good about the future. Mike Turner was respected on both sides of the aisle. He happened to have a rather more traditional view of our foreign policy and of Russian aggression than President-elect Trump has, clearly. And so Donald Trump did not have to tell Speaker Johnson to do this, right? Speaker Johnson would know that Trump does not want to have someone like Mike Turner heading the Intelligence Committee, speaking his mind, being openly critical, disagreeing with foreign policy steps that the president might take, and so he gets rid of Mike Turner. It's something he can do unilaterally, really, and this is as opposed to other things that Donald Trump will want the House to do, that Speaker Johnson can't do by himself, that he can't do with his fractious Republican caucus, and that he frankly needs help from Democrats to do basic things, passing a budget, just even getting organized, and so this is a freebie he can give to Donald Trump, and maybe, if you feed the beast, maybe it'll be satisfied for a while.
Well, yeah, the question is for how long, I guess, because we know, Gene, during Trump's first term, we saw several high-profile examples. Cabinet secretaries, for example, who defied him and found themselves out of a job. I'm thinking of Jeff Sessions, right, the Attorney General, Defense Secretary Mark Esper. So do you think the ouster of Turner sends a message to other Republicans, and will they listen to that message?
It definitely sends a message. Other Republicans will have to check their own consciences, and we'll have to wait for events and see what they do. This parade of cabinet nominees, Pam Bondi saying there's not going to be an enemies list, et cetera. They're saying the right things in these hearings, but what will they really do if they are, in fact, pressed by Trump to agree to a policy or to take an action that they know is wrong, that they know is counter to either law or propriety, or is just wrong, and yet to see. Did Jeff Sessions followed his conscience in many instances, and he was out. And I think if these cabinet officials and Republicans in Congress follow their consciences, I think there will be consequences for them as well.
So meantime, Vaughn, NBC News is reporting that Vivek Ramaswamy is emerging as a surprise prospect to fill J.D. Vance's old Senate seat. How involved is Donald Trump in pushing Ramaswamy's name, and why him?
Right. I actually just got off the phone before we came on air, Chris, with somebody who was telling me that effectively Donald Trump is wholly responsible for Vivek Ramaswamy potentially being the next U.S. senator out of Ohio to replace J.D. Vance. It's going to be ultimately a decision of Governor DeWine, whose lieutenant governor is also a potential Senate consideration, yet would like to run for governor. Vivek Ramaswamy actually several months ago took his name out of the running to be J.D. Vance's appointment because he wanted to run for governor, though. So the source was telling me that, of course, Vivek Ramaswamy has been helping lead this DOGE effort of government efficiency to find places where they can cut and restructure the executive branch of the federal government. And it was suggested to me that inside of the Senate, he would more effectively, on the outset, of conversations around like the continuing resolution that we saw play out just before the holidays, instead of Elon Musk and Donald Trump stepping in and going on X and putting out a social media post saying they're not behind this, and then everybody running to try to fix the continuing resolution or the budget on the back end of it. Essentially, if they have Vivek Ramaswamy in the Congress in real time, able to actively try to do Doge from inside of the halls of the Capitol, while working in conjunction with Russ Vought over at the Office of Management and Budget, then they would potentially be able to more effectively have Doge happen in real time. And that is why, for Donald Trump specifically, having Vivek Ramaswamy in that U.S. Senate capacity of such keen interest.